Right, Assalamu alaikum everybody, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Eid Mubarak. I'm excited to be here. This for me is the greatest way to spend your Eid. So even if no one else is here, there's nowhere else I would rather be. And subhanAllah, we've had a lot of like holidays and birthdays and things and anniversaries this year that fell on a halakha day. And so that's a gift to me. I think this is really like wonderful. So, and hopefully people will catch up with us after their Eid celebration, so it'll make it even doubly special, inshallah. So anyway, but I hope wherever you are, whatever you're doing, you're having an amazing Eid. And I wanted to actually, on that note, well, first of all, let me start, but as always, I have to mention how incredible the khutbah was yesterday, because I feel like every week just, adds a new level of understanding to our world and what's happening behind the scenes. Yesterday, the khutbah I think is titled "The Trust," and when you put your hands in the hands of the indecent. And so it was extremely timely because we're talking about Surah Al Ahzab, and we're talking about the issue of the amana, the trust that Allah gave to human beings. And Shaykh talked yesterday about this metaphor, what it means, and then also moved into what's happening in the Middle East as Biden is getting ready to head there, and all of the workings that are happening behind the scenes, and what is basically building up to a conflict based on this idea of Sunnis via Shi'is. It was a really in-depth, important khutbah that every Muslim should listen to understand what is happening in our world. And it closed with also a summation of what happened at Hajj, because as people know, Shaykh has been talking about the circumstances under which Hajj is controlled. And now we have seen the consequences of what happens when people have invested, their life savings into going to Hajj, and that money is given to this agency that has ties to the Modi, very Islamophobic Indian government. Lots of people lost their money. Lots of people were told that they had reservations only to discover that they didn't actually have reservations or a place to stay. There was no refunds that were happening. A lot of people obviously spend their entire life waiting for this one opportunity, and to have that crushed with no recourse is devastating. And so therefore the idea of what happens when you put your hand in the hands of the indecent, and there's just so much learning. So I really have to underscore how important it is for everyone to watch that. But on this Eid Al Adha, I thought I would also share a really important thing that we had actually posted on social media, but there are people who either don't see it or are not on social media. But it was, this idea of giving money to the slaughter of animals, and the idea of the, adiyah and alternative ways to approach this, because clearly a lot of people are concerned about how animals are treated. They're concerned about being vegan and not wanting their money going to killing animals or having animals being treated cruelly. So I just wanted to call attention to this really lovely answer that Shaykh had written in response to a question actually quite a few years ago. You can find it on the searchforbeauty.org website, but it has to do with the sacrifice of Eid Al Adha. And, as you can imagine, Shaykh, the person who writes is asking, basically she's got, concerns about, the treatment of animals, and does she need to give money for this in support of it? Are there other things to do? So he, of course, gives a whole history of, the ruling, and I just wanted to share this very last part. It's a long write-up, and it's really worth everyone's time to read and understand, but this was really special. Note that there is another suppressed and forgotten meaning in the whole logic of the Udiyah. The initial idea was to bring the various classes of society together in a social event where the poor dine with the rich, eating the food items of the rich at the same table. In other words, the sunnah was to slaughter animals and then to share the meat with needy families in festive social events. Today, Muslims have transformed the practice so it has lost much of its original meaning. The disparate classes of society do not come together over festive events, but rather meat is distributed in ways that are impersonal and at times demeaning to the needy. In order to rekindle the meaning and true spirit of Eid Al Adha, I would recommend that other than paying the zakat due at Eid Al Adha, which, as I said above, is not necessarily limited to payment to a butcher, but could be a payment directly to the needy, that one, organize meals and social events that would bring the community together and would fulfill the original meaning of Eid Al Adha in acts of sharing and kindness with others. I do realize that so many Muslims today seem to be under the misimpression that the whole point of Eid Al Adha is either to slaughter a sheep or pay for the slaughter of the sheep. The point of Eid Al Adha is not the sheep or the meat. The point is sharing and community, and above all, brotherhood and sisterhood in the true sense of the word. To my knowledge, among the classical jurists, it is well established that money can be dispensed directly to the needy so that they may feed themselves in the way they see most fit, and one does not need to be limited to the distribution of meat. In fact, some jurists have allowed the distribution of whatever food material is most expensive and unattainable by the needy, be it meat or some other consumption item. So I thought that was really beautiful, and again, you can find the full write-up on the searchforbeauty.org website under the fatwa section. And in that spirit, I thought I would just share some really wonderful organizations that are serving the needy, and especially now in these times where we know there's a lot of really difficult times. There's a huge famine about to take place or taking place in Somalia. There, obviously people in need, Muslims in particular, all around the world. So I wanted to share some of these organizations that I have found to be amazing. OxfamAmerica.org. They do a lot of work in 90 countries around the world. They help refugees, but they also get involved in climate change and other issues that serve the disempowered. UMRelief.org. They're working in Bangladesh. The Little Hearts Foundation, which is, of course, we've talked about here before, which takes care of Syrian orphans. I love Doctors Without Borders because they help people all around the world. LifeUSA.org, which is also known as Life for Relief and Development. They have a really wonderful orphans program also. Amoud, AMOUD, Foundation.org, that works in Africa. So that's a really great place to support, all the people that are suffering from lack of food and water. And then for the Uyghurs, there's the Campaign for Uyghurs.org, and then there's also the Uyghur Human Rights Project, UHRP.org. And then lastly, I thought I would also mention this really incredible organization that most people know. It's JewishVoiceForPeace.org. And I think the reason why they're very interesting. They have a really cool story if you don't know it. This was an organization that was started back in 1996 by 3 UC Berkeley students, and they were an all-volunteer group that opposed what was happening in Israel with the Palestinians. And they started just as, like a peace group. And then in 2002, they decided to build a larger grassroots base. And then they started raising funds. And so today they have 200,000 supporters, 10,000 individual donors, 60 chapters across the U.S., a staff of 28, a rabbinic council, an artist council, an academic advisory council, a health council, a youth wing, and an advisory board consisting of some of the best-known Jewish thinkers of our time. This is important because their position is actually really consistent with what Muslims want for Israel and Palestine. They they support BDS. They were the first major Jewish group that demanded that American military aid be withheld until Israel ends its occupation. They believe in the right to return of Palestinians, and they believe that Israel needs to acknowledge the Nakba, which was in 1947 and through 1949. And they also argue, obviously, that you can be critical of Israel without being accused of being an anti-Semite. So, a lot of what they are working for is, as they say, political conditions that will allow Israelis and Palestinians to achieve a just and lasting peace. And they are, working to change U.S. policy and, believe in the human rights, all of the articles of human rights that should apply. So they do a lot of really important work, and I think that they are particularly effective because they are working from, within the Jewish tradition, but they are very open-minded, and I found that they are, one of these sort of I think, exemplar organizations where you can work from within a faith tradition, but you're working based on principle and virtue for the betterment of humanity and a situation. And that's, I think, a role model for Muslim organizations and all organizations, in fact. So I think it's a really important cause also to support as Muslims. So I just wanted to share that. I think that there's so much that we can do. There are a lot of people doing really good work on the front line and in the spirit of Eid and taking care of others and, donating, that this is a wonderful way to celebrate the Eid and bring some goodness into the world, especially as we continue learning more about Surah Al Ahzab. So thank you, everybody, for joining us on the Eid, and I'm looking forward to an amazing session, an amazing continuation of the discussion of the Surah. So thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. سبحان الله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد خاتم الأنبياء والرسل أجمعين المرسل رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله الأطهار الميامين وعلى أصحابه المختارين وعلى من اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي يا رب العالمين. طيب, so I'm told we stopped at around verse 19. A quick, just so we're all in the quick overview. So we recall that although Surah Al Ahzab begins with a rather surprising beginning because it focuses on the way that people manipulate or construct, proclaim reality, and the illegitimacy of social constructions that are either unjust, like the dhihar, which we've talked about, which, as we said, although directly addressed in Surah Al-Mujadala, persisted as a practice. So the difficulty that human beings have, even when they say we believe, and even when they say we submit, and even when they say we obey, the difficulty that human beings have in actually internalizing and implementing. So whether it is an institution like the Har, where it is an oppressive, unfair institution to women involved, or a practice that is very well intentioned, but that alters biological lineage, and it is, we can't just say adoption, because it's what does adoption mean? It is not the prohibition is not that you commit to taking care of an orphan. The prohibition is that you alter the name of the orphan, um, terminating natural biological relations or the potential for natural biological relations, while giving orphans the name of the adoptee. And from that, beginning, as we said, then that's juxtaposed with the fact that Allah does have the power to reconstruct reality. So in terms of who has the right, the legitimacy to create constructions that are not if you want to be technical about the constructions in law, well, it is Allah that has that power and not you human beings. I didn't mention this last halaqah, but Al-Razi is probably the only commentator, if as far as I can remember, the only commentator that I remember that notices this and says, but he takes it to a very legal point. And Al-Razi says that the reason for this juxtaposition is to underscore legal facts established by Sharia. That something could be a Sharia fact, although contrary to social fact. Now, this is actually in legal systems. This is well known, legal presumptions, whether rebuttable or irrebuttable, but that law will often say, as far as the law is concerned, such and such is a fact. Whether this is, it doesn't necessarily have to be logical and it doesn't necessarily have to be actual, but it serves a purpose in law. But I think that here, even beyond law, is this all relates, in my view, in Surah Al Ahzab, to that central theme about two hearts in one chest. That a true commitment would enable you to have the type of resolve and determination to accept the constructions, to accept the reality that Allah wants you to believe in, rather than the reality that your own ego experiences. And we notice that this, of course, is essential for faith, because none of us experience alam al-ghayb, or if we even experience alam al-ghayb, it's to a very limited extent. We only experience an extremely small part of alam al-ghayb. So, if we have paranormal experiences or supernatural experiences and so on, it's part of alam al-ghayb, but it's so small that it doesn't really allow us any real insight in alam al-ghayb. But yet belief, iman, is anchored on what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us about alam al-ghayb. And to fully be aware that my construction of reality, to internalize the idea that my construction of reality, I defer to what Allah tells me over what I actually experience in person turns out to be, as we will see further, extremely critical for the project of belief itself, for the very project of Iman. Okay, and from that, then Allah takes us to the experience that Surah Al Ahzab is most commonly associated with, and that's the Siege of Mecca, that's Siege of Medina. And that at no time are human beings tried and tested to, in fact, abandon their convictions and their beliefs, like when it goes against perceived self-interest. And in a state of crisis tests your perceived sense of self-interest. I mean, in the most, if you might have to give up your life, perceived self-interest is the preservation of life. You might have to stick by principle, taking extreme risks that if sticking by principle doesn't go your way, then the price you have to pay will be extremely high. Perceived self-interest is, as we saw, is what enables people to break away from the guidance of the Prophet ﷺ, from, in fact, from staying the course with the Prophet ﷺ, and to start thinking about, well, what would serve me personally? And as we saw, that this is precisely when people start saying, well, you know, biyutana awra, that our homes are awra, meaning that, you know, can we go protect our homes and leave you to your fate? They're thinking of, well, you know, if the kuffar, the Confederates win this battle, and we can say, well, you know, we were not at the trench. And as we saw, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Ahzab tells them that Allah knows that although you pretended to still remain Muslim, when you told the Prophet, you asked Prophet for permission to withdraw and go take care of your own families, that Allah knows that if in fact the Confederates would have been victorious, you would have reneged on your entire faith. And you would have said whatever would be needed to save your necks and to promote your own. But an extreme test, it is like when you test metal, you apply extreme heat and extreme pressure. A lot of times, in order to see the truth of things, you know, a lot of times when we want to see things at the most truthful level, at the most molecular level, at the quantum level, we apply what? Energy. We apply extreme pressure, extreme heat. And that's Allah's sunnah in creation. The truth of things is often revealed under extreme tests, not when human beings are free to indulge their fantasies, to construct their fantasies and proclaim their fantasies and demand that other people believe their fantasies, but times of real test. Okay. And as we said, that the whole set of events in digging the trench and camping next to the mountain and withstanding the physical hardship and the demoralization of hunger and so on, the narratives that tell us the extent of hardship that Muslims endured, that level of heat that was applied as a test in the Battle of the Trench, are many. So for instance, there is a famous narrative from Huzaifa bin Yaman. And again, it has the earmarks of medieval exaggeration in some parts, or not exaggeration, but medieval presentation. I should put it this way. But it's describing a basic essential truth. So Huzaifa bin Yaman, the report goes that he's in Kufa, and there's a young man who tells Huzaifa bin Yaman, you actually lived at the time of the Prophet. This is after the Prophet had passed away. And you encountered the Prophet, you dealt with the Prophet. And of course, Huzaifa is a well-known companion. He says, yes, And the young man says, God, you are so lucky. If it was us, meaning his generation, if it was us who would have met the Prophet and encountered the Prophet, we would have carried him. We would have taken care of him, even carrying him on our shoulders everywhere. And we would have served him, with complete commitment. And Huzaifa bin Yaman tells this young man, be careful what you're saying. And he starts telling him about the events of the Battle of the Trench. And he says, in the Battle of the Trench, things had gotten so desperate that the Prophet ﷺ calls upon the companions and says, he wants to send one of the companions on a mission, and it's basically a reconnaissance mission. And that and here, this is where you get the nature of a medieval narrative, is that he prays, and then after he finishes praying, he stands up and he says, who will volunteer to go on a reconnaissance mission? And he said, no one volunteered. And then he went back and prayed, and then he came out of prayer, and then he said, who will volunteer to go on a reconnaissance mission? And no one volunteered. And Huzaifa explains that all of the companions were hungry, exhausted, shivering from the cold, and just completely worn out. And then this happens 3 times. For a third time, who will volunteer? No one volunteers. And then he says, the narrative says, that the Prophet ﷺ for the 4th time comes out and he calls upon Huzaifa bin Yaman personally. And he says, Huzaifa, come. And Huzaifa explains in the narrative that I was sitting shivering from exhaustion, hunger, and cold, and that I walked to the Prophet struggling to stabilize myself, and extremely, that basically I was not, this is in the tradition itself, that that I was not happy that I was chosen for the mission. Then the narrative goes on to say that then the Prophet ﷺ puts his hand on me and he prays that Allah gives me strength and energy, and suddenly all the pain and all the anxiety went away. You know, Allahu A'lam whether this is historical or an exaggeration, or in fact, some type of, it could possibly have happened in some form or another. But what we get from these narratives is a sense of how difficult that test is or was. Of course, the reconnaissance, he does send Huzaifa bin Yaman on a reconnaissance mission, and Huzaifa is basically, he goes, sneaks to the camp of the enemy to see the impact of the wind and cold on them. And he comes back reporting that they are extremely demoralized, and that their alliance is breaking apart. But the part that I'm just focusing on is that the intensity of the test and the fact that a sizable group of Muslims, whether you get various reports that say the people that withdrew from the trench and went back to Medina were Banu Haritha or Banu Salama or Ashab al-Aws bin Qayzi. Yes, it included these people, but when you put a list of all the names that have been generated, it's clear that it was a majority of the army that asked permission to go back to Medina, and that the defenders of the trench were the most faithful and the most resolute. There are many other issues that we could have talked about with the Battle of the Trench. There's, for instance, the story of Naeem Bin Meshod. This is a story that is often taught to children, and when Naeem Bin Meshod reportedly, according to these narratives, plays a critical role in breaking up the alliance of the Confederates, and that it was not known that Naeem Bin Meshod was a Muslim, and that the Prophet ﷺ sends him on a disinformation mission, basically. And reportedly that he goes to Banu Qurayza and he tells the Jewish tribe, when you talk to the Meccans, Banu Qurayza thinks that Naeem bin Meshod is not a Muslim and that he's an ally. And so and he is from the tribe of Ghatafan, which is a Najdi tribe. Anyway, so he tells Banu Qurayza that I don't trust the Qurayshis, and the Qurayshis might ultimately betray you and withdraw and let you face Muhammad alone. So, as a surety that the Qurayshis will not betray you, tell Quraysh that you want hostages, that you want that they should leave with you men, Qurayshi men, as a surety that they're not going to betray you. And then at the same time, he goes to the Qurayshis and to his own tribe, Ghatafan, and he says, the Banu Qurayza, you can't trust them, that they plan to betray you, and in fact, what they're planning to do is they're planning to ask for hostages, and then when you give them these hostages, they're going to turn the hostages that you give them over to Muhammad, and this way prove their loyalty to Muhammad. And the Quraysh and Ghatafan fall for it, and they say, oh really? And then when Banu Qurayza in fact do show up and they say, we want hostages, they say, oh my God, Naeem Bin Meshod must have been right, and that this plays a role in breaking the alliance of the Confederacy. Does it, describe a kernel of truth, historical truth? Maybe. I'm very skeptical about the story, although it's taught frequently. I mean, largely because Naeem bin Meshod, it seems very suspicious to me that Naeem bin Meshod would have that type of leverage with the Qurayshis and with Banu Qurayza. It's possible. It's possible that I'm missing something. It's not material, but as we will see, there is a significant point that has to do with ambiguity and obscurity, historical ambiguity. Just remember that, because we'll come back to it. And it's something that people don't realize about Surah Al Ahzab, because the historical ambiguities are numerous, as we will see. The historical ambiguities are numerous. Yeah, I mean, there's just so much. There's also, for another story, Allahu Alam, this, with the family of the Prophet ﷺ was put in the residence of Hassan ibn Thabit, as I mentioned last halaqah, the famous poet. And there's an interesting narrative. Was it Safiya? Did I write it down? No. I'm pretty sure it was Safiya bint Abdul Muttalib. So they're in that residence, and Banu Qurayza sends someone to start staking out the residence of the Prophet, the family of the Prophet residing in the residence of Hassan ibn Thabit during the battle. Banu Qurayza is expecting that the Confederates are going to win the battle, and that when they do, they're going to attack the residents of Hassan ibn Thabit and take all the family of the Prophet as slaves. So there is a guy staking out, sort of on a reconnaissance mission, seeing who is where in the residence of Hassan ibn Thabit. And Safiya bint Abdul Muttalib notices that this guy from Banu Qurayza is on a reconnaissance mission. And she goes to Hassan ibn Thabit, the poet, and says, there is a man out there staking out the place, and I recognize the man, he's such and such from the tribe of Banu Qurayza. We're in danger. Go out and deal with him. And Hassan ibn Thabit says, I'm not a man of warfare. I'm not a man of arms. I'm not a fighter, in other words. I'm a poet. So he refuses to go out to deal with him. And then the report goes on that Safiya then takes a sword and goes and has combat with this fellow and ends up killing him. Again, is it a historical fact? I'm not sure. But another one of the things about the Battle of the Trench is there are numerous narratives that have to do with the role that women played in the Battle of the Trench. So, for instance, what was her name? Did I write her down? The way I remember her name is that I try to remember Rafida. Rufaida. Okay, that's why. Yeah. So I think of Rafida and then I remember Rufaida. So this one was called Rufaida, and she ran the battle hospital. She ran the hospital on the battlefield, and all the wounded, including a very important figure, Sa'd ibn Mu'az, who was wounded with an arrow, was placed in Rufaida's residence, which she had turned into a hospital for the wounded. Rufaida ends up playing a very big role because, as you know, all these people are withdrawing. She refuses to withdraw and remains in the center of the battlefield. Keep that in mind, because we'll see something about Surah Al Ahzab that would make us think about the narratives that emphasize the like Safiya bint Abdul Muttalib, taking the sword and doing combat with this fellow, or like Rufaida, and there are many other traditions as well. Anyway, so to stay with the text of the surah in its own progression, so we recall the vivid Quranic description of the role that fear plays. This is Ayah 19. So that the translation is not. I mean, it's nothing particularly special. So, فإذا جاء الخوف رأيتهم ينظرون إليك تدور أعينهم كالذي يخشى عليه من الموت. Their eyes are rolling in absolute terror as they face the possibility of death. That extremely meek status, they are reduced to pieces as they confront a threat. But if you see them in the state, you would be completely surprised at how they are when there is no fear. When there is no fear, as you find in Ayah 19, صَلَقُوكُمْ بِأَلْسِنَةٍ حِدَادٍ أَشِحَّةً عَلَى الْخَيْرِ. When there is no fear, they talk big, and they are critical, and they are nasty, and they are not nice. In fact, أَشِحَّ عَلَى الْخَيْرِ means that even if they do good, they do it begrudgingly. And they keep track of the good they do and hold it over you. They're, as we said before, that an essential part of the commitment as a Muslim is the ability to do good and not remember it. That you present good for good's sake. But this is not the nature of these people. And in fact, these are the people who, even after the defeat of the Confederacy, what does the Quran tell us? Tell us something very, if we think about it, it is very natural about human beings. يَحْسَبُونَ الْأَحْزَابَ لَمْ يَذْهَبُوا. So, their attitude is, well, how do we know that they won't come back? So it is not that it's not just that they fell to pieces, but their psychology is a broken psychology. Well, how do we know it's safe now? How do we know? Because they're constantly thinking of safety. They're constantly thinking about their experience of reality. Not a cause, not a principle, not a prophet. So, even when they saw the Confederates withdraw, the immediate reaction is that they're still cowering. And they're still, the state of anxiety continues because they are subservient to their anxiety. And then, وَإِنْ يَأْتِ الْأَحْزَابُ يود لو أنهم بادون في الأعراب. And in fact, Allah tells Muslims that if the Confederates would show up again, these people would hope that they are anywhere but with you. بادون في الأعراب means the people who were settled in urban centers. It would always be considered an expression of, like you say, of the worst thing that could happen. And the worst thing that could happen is what? Is that I would roam around with the desert people because I'm settled in an urban center. So Allah is telling us that, in fact, if the Confederates come back, they would be happy for the worst possible scenario where they're roaming around with the desert people, finding out about what happened to you remotely. So, in other words, it's like when if you're a coward and you see a bully beating on someone, beating on your friend, or beating on your brother or something, and you start distancing yourself from the beating because you don't want it happening to you, so you want to observe it as if you are receiving, you're witnessing, you adopt the role of a witness, but you don't want to be a participant. In other words, because you don't want to be beaten. Well, they want to be roaming around like with desert people, witnessing your massacre, as long as it's not happening to them. Okay. And Allah tells Muslims, and indeed, وَلَوْ كَانُوا فِيكُمْ مَا قَاتَلُوا إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. This is verse 20. And in fact, indeed, if they were with you, they wouldn't have fought very hard. They would have fought a little bit and ran away. The moral example here is the example set by the Prophet ﷺ. لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ لِمَنْ كَانَ يَرْجُو اللَّهَ وَالْيَوْمَ الْآخِرِ وَذَكَرَ اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا. So, those who in fact, their hearts, their soul, are saturated with ذكر الله, ذكر الله كثيرا, that was here dhikr means the reality of Allah. Their reality would come from seeing the Prophet ﷺ as their moral example. If the Prophet is making a stand, I make a stand. If the Prophet is sacrificing everything, I sacrifice everything. If the Prophet is not withdrawing, I don't withdraw. And Allah juxtaposes those who see their Prophet as their example with لما رأى المؤمنون الأحزاب قالوا هذا ما وعدنا الله ورسوله وصدق الله ورسوله وما زادهم إلا إيمانا وتسليما. That those who anchor themselves in the reality set, constructed by the Prophet ﷺ being the example, when they see these overwhelming odds, the Confederates laying siege to Medina, they do what is easy to read but difficult to internalize. Because, notice, in 22, what is it that they do? Well, they say this is what God and God's apostle had promised us. Truly, God and God's apostle spoke the truth, and this increased their faith. So, confronted with overwhelming odds, they say, well, this is God's promise. And God's promise increases our faith. In a word, a level of surrender that you find with people who are completely committed to a cause. The cause is what is important. Whether and the fate of the cause is all that matters, not my own personal fate or the fate of those that I love. Okay. Now, we come to one of perhaps one of the most famous Quranic verses. من المؤمنين رجال صدقوا ما عاهدوا الله عليه فمنهم من قضى نحبه ومنهم من ينتظر وما بدلوا تبديلا. The Arabic here is sublime. Allah comes and says, there are believers that they took their covenant with Allah seriously. صدقوا ما عاهدوا الله عليه. They took their covenant with God very seriously. And because they took that covenant very seriously, it is as if some of them have already passed away and the others are waiting to pass away. In other words, death has become to them a mere formality. وَمَا بَدَّلُوا تَبْدِيلًا. Let's see how Muhammad Asad translates this. Yeah. Muhammad Asad says, and such as yet await its fulfillment without having changed their resolve in the least. ما بدلوا تبديلا. They have not compromised in any part of what their commitment and their covenant and their resolve was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, probably we could do 24. ليجزي الله الصادقين بصدقهم ويعذب المنافقين إن شاء أو يتوب عليهم إن الله كان غفورا رحيما. That okay, no, let's hold on. So this revelation you find in the tradition, and this goes back to sort of the historical ambiguities that pepper so many aspects of Surah Al Ahzab. All these reports that tell you that this verse, that there are believers who are either have already died in God's cause or waiting to do so. That tell you, for instance, that this was revealed about Mus'ab bin Umair. Mus'ab bin Umair died in the Battle of Uhud, and yeah, it was he that the reports say that the Prophet ﷺ, then when they found the body of Mus'ab ibn Umair martyred in Uhud, then the Prophet recited this verse, and that when they were trying to bury Mus'ab ibn Umair, they found that he didn't have a garment big enough to be buried in. That the only that he was so poor that the only garment that they found, if they covered his head, his feet showed. If they covered his feet, his head showed. There are other reports that tell you that no, this verse was revealed about Anas ibn Nadar. Anas ibn Nadar was again killed in the Battle of Uhud. They found his body with 80 stabs and cuts. So he fought valiantly in the Battle of Uhud and sustained. If you have 80 stabs and cuts, that means that you kept fighting to the last breath. Now, of course, what is the issue here? Well, Anas ibn Nadar and Mus'ab ibn Umair were both killed in Uhud before Al Ahzab. So, how could this verse have been revealed either at Uhud or about Uhud when. Now, it could be that it could be a transmission issue, that people thought, well, this verse seems to fit what these martyrs did in Uhud, and eventually that correlation turned into in narratives and to an actual cause for revelation. So people, first say, well, this describes these great people, and then eventually people start, misremember and start saying, well, this was a cause for revelation. Of course, the other possibility, not very likely, is that although this verse was revealed about in Ahzab, that we have something from the Prophet ﷺ that says, well, it was revealed now about a prior event, but we don't have something like that from the Prophet. But you find the sort of, and again, we've been exposed to quite a few of them, but you find these types of inconsistencies in the tradition all the time, where you're dealing with a later revelation, and then suddenly you have reports that tell you, oh well, this verse existed at some earlier event, and you say, but how could it have existed at an earlier event when it was revealed later? And the transmitters of hadith often, they were not historians. And this was their goal was not to produce a history. Their goal was to preserve reports. So whether the reports conflicted with one another or were inconsistent or not didn't bother them. It didn't concern them. They simply preserved reports. Okay. Now, notice in 25, وَرَدَّ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا بِغَيْظِهِمْ لَمْ يَنَالُوا خَيْرًا وَكَفَى اللَّهُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ القِتَالَ وَكَانَ اللَّهُ قَوِيًّا عَزِيزًا. In 25, that Allah repelled the aggressors and frustrated them. But this mention that Allah saved you from having وَكَفَى اللَّهُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ الْقِتَالَ, which is again a very famous Quranic phrase, often misused. When people want to be cowards, they'll say, وَكَفَى اللَّهُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ الْقِتَالَ, meaning, oh, Allah made it unnecessary for us to fight. So they're misusing the revelation. But what that Quranic expression, let's see how Muhammad Asad translates it. It says, is Muhammad Asad just says, since God was enough to protect the believers in battle, seeing that God is most powerful and almighty. وَكَفَى اللَّهُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ الْقِتَالَ, it's like saying Allah made it unnecessary for the believers to fight. And this is often taken as referring to the fact that the Confederates were frustrated by the trench, and eventually weather conditions made the Confederates lose heart. That cold and wind, and that Allah made the wind that blew through frustrated an enemy that is not committed to a cause. Of course, that wind affected Muslims as well, because we have many reports about how cold they were. But the people that remained with the Prophet ﷺ were the committed people. Okay. Now, we come to 26. وأنزل الذين ظاهروهم من أهل الكتاب من صياصيهم وقذف في قلوبهم الرعب فريقا تقتلون وتأسرون فريقا وأورثكم أرضهم وديارهم وأموالهم وأرضا لم تطئوها وكان الله على كل شيء قديرا. This is 26 and 27. So, and God brought down from their strongholds those of the followers of earlier revelation who aided the aggressors, and cast terror into their hearts. Some you slew, and some you made captive. And God made you heirs to their lands and their homes and their goods, and promised you lands on which you never set foot. For God has indeed the power to will anything. Here we pause, because this is often taken, or this is normally taken as a reference to the fate of the tribe of Banu Qurayza. So we remember that the entire battle of the Confederates, two Jewish tribes, the Jewish tribe that was expelled, Banu Nadir, played a huge role in arranging for the Confederacy that laid siege to Mecca. And Banu Qurayza, which played a critical role in the real terror, and that is a betrayal, a stab in the back that made Muslims particularly vulnerable. Now, here we again get into the issue of reports. Bear with me, because this all is leading to a very important point. So we have reports that after the battle of after the withdrawal of the Confederates, the Prophet ﷺ is resting, and Muslims who remained with the Prophet are breathing a sigh of relief and resting, and then the angel Gabriel, and in fact the traditions are a little bit very much carry the air of medieval narratives, that the angel Gabriel appears on a horse, very dusty, comes to the Prophet and says, "You guys have put down your weapons. Do you think the battle has ended?" And the Prophet says, "Yes, we have." And Gabriel says, "Well, we angels haven't put down our weapons. Um, you have to proceed to Banu Qurayza and lay siege to Banu Qurayza who betrayed you, and they're still there in their fortress." And thereupon Muslims march onto Banu Qurayza and lay siege to the fortress of Banu Qurayza for 25 days before Banu Qurayza eventually surrender. There are reports, for instance, about the role of someone called Abu Lubaba, and that during the siege, Abu Lubaba reportedly betrays Muslims. How does he betray Muslims? And is that he is sent as, he is a go-between, an emissary between Banu Qurayza in their fortress and the forces that are laying siege to the fortress. And Banu Qurayza asks Abu Lubaba, what does Muhammad have in store for us? And Banu Lubaba points to his neck like this, basically meaning that he plans to slaughter you. And then Banu Lubaba realizes that he had betrayed Muslims by leaking what the intentions of the sort of what Muslims have in store for the tribe of Banu Qurayza, which of course then would mean that Banu Qurayza would have greater resolve to resist. And Banu Lubaba, as the narrative goes, then goes into this crisis of regret and contrition, because he goes to the mosque and actually ties himself to a pillar and says, "I will not release myself from this pillar until the Prophet forgives me," and so on and so forth. But this Banu Lubaba narrative is itself problematic, because there are narratives that tell us that the way the issue with Banu Qurayza was resolved is through the role of Sa'd ibn Mu'az. Sa'd ibn Mu'az was from the tribe of Banu Qurayza. And Banu Qurayza, before Islam, before the Prophet arrived in Medina, were allies of... I misspoke. He was not from the tribe of Banu Qurayza, he was from the tribe of Aus. That Sa'd ibn Mu'az was from the tribe of Aus, and the tribe of Aus are close allies of Banu Qurayza before the Prophet came to Medina. And after the siege continues for 25 days, the Jewish tribe of Banu Qurayza says, we're willing to surrender if a member of our former allies, the Aus tribe, arbitrates our fate, decides upon our fate. Now, thinking that if we get someone from the Aus to arbitrate our fate, then because they are our former allies, they will give us favorable terms. And then they were asked, well, are you fine with Sa'd ibn Mu'az arbitrating? And Banu Qurayza says, yes, Sa'd ibn Mu'az is perfect. And the tradition goes on to say that Sa'd ibn Mu'az, his ruling is that the men of the males in the tribe of Banu Qurayza be executed, and the females and children be taken as captives or slaves. But the narrative about Abu Lubaba, if you try to make it jive with the narrative about Sa'd ibn Mu'az, it doesn't work unless there was some type of conspiracy and trickery going on. If you accept the Abu Lubaba tradition, and he tells them that the Prophet plans to slaughter you, but then Sa'd ibn Mu'az arbitrates, and this just happens to be his arbitration, that would have very unflattering connotations about the Prophet. That he was planning this all along. And of course, some of the commentators noticed this, and they tried to make it jive and say, well, you know, it is that the Prophet was hoping that this would be the ruling of Sa'd ibn Mu'az, but that he told Abu Lubaba that this is what he's hoping for, execution of the men and the enslavement of the men and the women and children, but he didn't tell this to Sa'd ibn Mu'az, which absolutely doesn't make sense, because Abu Lubaba didn't have that type of position in Medinian society. He was not a confidant of the Prophet, and in fact there is very little that is known about him, and doesn't seem to have even been a confidant or even close to the tribe of Banu Qurayza. So here we have an ambiguity, a historical ambiguity. The very narrative about Sa'd ibn Mu'az is itself problematic. The narratives say Sa'd ibn Mu'az was injured and he was hit by an arrow in the Battle of the Trench, and he was on his deathbed in Rufaida's home, the woman who's running the hospital. And in fact, shortly after he issues his ruling, Sa'd ibn Mu'az passes away from his injury. And some of the narrative says that the basis for his ruling is Talmudic law. And it is true that in Jewish law, in Deuteronomy, the punishment for a treacherous ally is exactly that, the execution of men and the enslavement of women and children. But, and there's, by the way, there was someone who wrote a MA thesis at Johns Hopkins about this. While we are told that as many as 600 men were executed, there is something very fishy about these reports. One, many of the reports about the execution of the Jewish men make the Jewish men appear heroic as they faced their death. In fact, there's even a report about the execution of a woman who, according to the report attributed to Aisha, goes to her death laughing. And she's reportedly the only Jewish woman executed. And she was executed because she murdered a Muslim, or reportedly, that's what. But what is thing about these reports is that they if you read them, the Jewish men are very brave as they go to their death. Some of the key figures from the tribe of Banu Qurayza that we were told, all the leaders of Banu Qurayza, all the men of Banu Qurayza were supposed to have been executed, pop up as figures either in Khaybar or in Sham or in Yemen. And this is what the MA that was written in Johns Hopkins, that traced some of the main families of Banu Qurayza and traced that, they were supposed to be executed, but then we get narrative. And this whole narrative about the fate of the tribe of Banu Qurayza, first, notice what the Quran says about it. وأنزل الذين ظاهروهم من أهل الكتاب من صياصيهم, meaning got those, here Ahl Kitab, people of the books, are the Jewish tribe, is the Jewish tribe, to abandon al-Sayasi, their fortifications, to abandon their fortifications, to come down from their fortification. وَقَذَفَ فِي قُلُوبِهِمُ الرُّعْبِ, and made them lose heart. فَرِيقًا تَقْتُلُونَ وَتَأْسُرُونَ فَرِيقًا. Some of them you kill, and a group that you kill, and a group that you capture. The language here is a typical language for what would happen in war, that you capture some as captives of war and you kill some. There's no mention of executions or a massacre, which is inconsistent with what the Quran says about prisoners of war generally. But the other thing is that the very origin of the reports about Sa'd ibn Mu'az is transmitted by, they're considered among the Israelite traditions, meaning traditions by Jewish converts to Islam. So Jewish converts to Islam that said that Muslims executed 600 men, Jewish men, that went to their death very bravely. In fact, some of these reports say that when given a choice to not be executed and have their children and have their wives and have their property, they chose to die with their compatriots, but not save their own necks. It is deeply suspicious to me, the authenticity of the fate of Banu Qurayza is deeply suspicious. Some, like Al-Razi and Al-Zamakhshari, don't even mention the fate with great elaboration. And I suspect it was for the same reasons. Where you get the greatest elaborations is in tafsir like al-Tabari or al-Baghawi or Ibn Kathir, the naql oriented tafsir. Why am I spending so much time with the ambiguities? You'll see why. But just keep in mind all these ambiguities that we are tracing. So, ambiguity about the role of Abu Lubaba, ambiguity about the role of Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, ambiguity about the fate of Banu Qurayza, but it doesn't even end here. There is a woman from Banu Qurayza called Rayhana bint Zayd bint Amr bin Qunafa. First, there is an ambiguity as to whether Rayhana was from the tribe of Banu Nadir or the tribe of Banu Qurayza. If she's from the tribe of Banu Nadir, then what is she doing being a captive of war after the Battle of the Trench? If she's from Banu Qurayza, then that makes better sense. There are narratives that say that Rayhana bin Zayd was one of the captives, Jewish captives, and that she is given to the Prophet as a captive of war. And then we get into numerous ambiguities. And let me just go over some of them. Some say that there was never an enslaved woman called Rayhana in the first place. Many other reports insist that no, there was a Rayhana, and that she was, in fact, given to the Prophet. Many reports say that the Prophet freed her and married her. But she didn't convert to Islam. Other reports say no, that he freed her and married her and she converted to Islam. Other reports say that the Prophet freed her and gave her a choice to remain with him, give her a choice whether to remain with him and give her a choice whether to be Muslim or not, and she chose to remain Jewish but chose to remain with him. There are even reports that say that the Prophet married her but offered to free her, and she told him, I don't want to be freed. Why? Because those who were freed wives of the Prophet had to abide by the hijab, and she didn't want to abide by the hijab. So according to these traditions, she told him, فهو أخف علي وعليك, that keep me as a slave, don't free me, because not having to abide by the hijab, maintaining my slave status, is easier on me and easier on you. So we get this enormous amount of ambiguities about this Jewish character, Rayhana bin Zayd, and whether she was freed, whether there was a marriage, whether she was a Muslim, and so on. And whether she even existed in the first place, because that's also part of it. But again, so yet another ambiguity. This is all going to be a part of even if you feel like, oh, your head is hurting, wait, because we're leading to even a bigger headache. And then I'll tell you why we need all these headaches. Okay. I've delved into the Rayhana reports and make a very long story short. They're all of equal strength, all of them of equal strength, which is not very strong. Whether married, not married, Muslim, not Muslim, exist, not exist. Okay. So, but the Quran itself says that this is God's favor. Your enemy was vanquished. By the way, وَأَوْرَثَكُمْ أَرْضَهُمْ وَدِيَارَهُمْ وَأَمْوَالَهُمْ وَأَرْضًا لَمْ تَطْئُوهَا, that you've inherited their homes is normally the Quranic expression when a people have been exiled. And so that fellow at John Hopkins, who argues that in fact Banu Qurayza were there, he says that there were certain leaders of Banu Qurayza. He traces 6 of them that were executed as punishment for the treachery, but that the rest of the men were exiled. With the women and children, after they, unlike Banu Nadir was allowed to carry whatever property they can load up on their livestock. Banu Qurayza were not allowed to take any of their property. That's at least in what I remember reading. The guy who wrote the thesis, I tried to find out what happened to him. I couldn't. Well, I'm not very competent with the computer anyway, so my computer searches are a joke. The extent of what I do is I Google something, and if someone doesn't pop up on Google, then I don't know what to do. Um, but he is the son of the very famous uh, Egyptian Islamic scholar Jalal Kishk. Um, his son, whose first name was Khalid Kishk, did his doctorate at Johns Hopkins. And well, was it a doctorate that he wrote? No, I'm not remembering. It's many, many years ago. And so anyway, so I know that this is the thing that I researched, and I read it many, many years ago. This was early 90s. Um, but I don't know where he is now. I couldn't find. I don't know. It's unfortunate because his father was a great man. Okay. Just notice وأرضا لم تطئوها. So Muhammad Asad translates this. Um, and made you heirs to their lands, their houses, and their goods, and lands on which you have never set foot. Um, this is a prediction by the Quran that there are lands that you have yet never been to that will fall under your control. So I mean, it's pretty remarkable because you come at this point where Muslims are, yes, they they broke the siege of the Confederates, but this is the fifth hijrah, and the idea that seriously, we're going to be conquering lands, go from the defensive to actually conquering lands that we've never been to before. These are the types of predictions that you find in the Quran that tell you that the author of this book knows more than what a human being would know. Okay. Okay. So we talked about the ambiguities about the Battle of Banu Qurayza, the choice, the metaphor of two hearts in one chest. You can pick a heart that constructs reality according to your own needs and desires and whims, or a heart that abides by reality as your maker wants you to abide by. And you can't have it both ways. The very logic of this is that the path of those who pick a heart that commits to the referee, the source of truth, being Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's a much harder path. But with all the material defeats that path entails, it also entails miraculous victories that come directly from your Lord. So it is not that your blessings will make rational sense. They are an act of grace. Then it comes to another, it told us the wives of the Prophet ﷺ are your mothers. But then it will come to a challenge confronting the wives of the Prophet ﷺ. A huge challenge. And before we jump into that, keep in mind the subtext here from, we are talking about the battle of the trench and the survival of this community, but repeatedly the same Quranic style of going back to the microdynamics of family relations, the microdynamics of social relations, and says the victory begins here. Not in the grand strategies. The victory begins here, in the purity of the heart. Let's take a 2-minute break and then we'll get into the wives of the Prophet. Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So, then verse 27, or sorry, verse 28, which immediately then moves to talking about the wives of the Prophet ﷺ. يا أيها النبي قل لأزواجك إن كنتن تردن الحياة الدنيا وزينتها فتعالين أمتعكن وأسرحكن سراحا جميلا وإن كنتن تردن الله ورسوله والدار الآخرة فإن الله أعد للمحسنات منكن أجرا عظيما. This is 28 and 29. Let's see. Speaking to the Prophet ﷺ, say to your wives, if you desire the life of this world and its charms, well then I shall provide for you and release you in a becoming manner. And if you desire God and God's apostle, and thus the good of the life and the hereafter, and then know that verily for the doers of good among you, God has readied a mighty reward. So, the historical incident here is that the wives of the Prophet were making increasing material demands on him. Basically, this satisfied with the state of poverty that they lived in. And that this incrementally becomes a serious issue, a troubling, burdensome issue, to the point that the Prophet ﷺ doesn't, or swears, or abstains from being with his wives for 29 days. And that at the end of these 29 days comes the revelation that the Prophet is to give them a choice. Either they choose to remain with him and accept the harsh life that they would face with him, or the Prophet would release them, meaning divorce them. And it said, فَتَعَالَيْنِ أُمَتَّعْكُنَّ وَأُسَرِّحْكُنَّ سَرَاحًا جَمِيلًا, and I will let you go, and in letting you go, I will give you your rights and more, and I will let you go beautifully, meaning without hard feelings, without hardship, without pain, without so on. why does this occur right after the Battle of the Trench? Well, when Banu Nadir are defeated, there is yet another windfall. And the release from the withdrawal of the Confederates and the spoils of war that came from the defeat of Banu Nadir, the Prophet's wives saw the spoils of war going to everyone but the Prophet. And they naturally said, well, wait, why is everyone getting, after we've put up with all this hardship, why is everyone getting a bonus? Why is everyone getting their even the migrants who were homeless for up to this point, they got to get new homes. They got to, the homes that were left by Banu Nadir were inhabited by many of these migrants. But the only people whose fortunes and status remained unchanged, we've got nothing, are us. And the shattering, the gossiping, the talking increased amongst them, and more or less they formed a united front in saying, we want more. And it culminates in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala coming and saying, you either remain with the Prophet at whatever conditions that which they knew it means have-nots till the end, or you let you go and you'll have, you can have all the things that you are talking about, but not with this man. And being given the choice, all of them choose the Prophet, although again we get that element of ambiguity. Because we get a woman called Al-Amiriya who reportedly, her response was, no, I choose divorce. And the traditions say that Al-Amiriya, although we don't know very much about her at all, that later on, especially after the death of the Prophet, she used to go around saying, Ana shaqiyya, that I am the miserable one, that she regretted her choice. Allahu alam. I mean, again, it's very hard to figure out whether the reports about this woman are historical or not. But at that point, the Prophet ﷺ has 9 wives. Aisha, Hafsa, Salama, Habiba, Sauda, and then these are the Qurayshi wives. And then there is Safiya, who's from the tribe of Banu Khaybar. There is a woman called Maymuna al-Hilaliya, who's not a Qurayshi. She is, I'll talk about this in a second. Okay. And then there is a woman, Zainab bin Jahsh, and there's Juwayriya. Okay. The issue, though, is that at Safiya, does not become a wife of the Prophet till after the battle of Banu Khaybar, which is a few years after the Battle of the Trench. Maymuna doesn't become a wife of the Prophet till the seventh Hijri year, which is again a couple of years after the Battle of the Trench. So either this revelation is later than the Battle of the Trench, and although it was revealed after the Battle of the Trench, it was included in Surah Al Ahzab, or when this revelation was received, Safiya was not a wife of the Prophet, and Maymuna was not a wife of the Prophet either. So either this revelation, this ayah, is later, and then it was included in the surah, or when this revelation was received, the Prophet didn't have 9 wives, he had lesser wives than 9. By probably 7. And you might say, well, okay, so the Prophet had 7 wives. What's the problem? Well, you'll see what the problem is. It is not just that this revelation comes and gives the wives of the Prophet a choice. They, in turn, are demanded to accept the same type of choice. Do you choose the heart that is committed to God with all that the sacrifices that entails, or do you choose a heart because 2 hearts doesn't work? Again, that same theme, right? That you can't be with the Prophet and say, but that's not fair. We're not getting our share. Why is life so hard? Why are there so many sacrifices? And here I'm going to have to just go out of order, because I think for the sake of presentation a little bit. Now notice in Surah Al Ahzab, in this surah, if you move forward to verse 50 and 51 and 52, something happens in Surah Al-Ahzab that is very important. And that is, as we will see, but I'm just skipping ahead to because that will help the presentation, is that Allah comes and says, not only are there regulations for the wives of the Prophet, but as we will see, arguably Allah puts a limit and tells the Prophet, you cannot have any more wives. That whoever you're married to, and you cannot add to your wives. وَلَوْ أَعْجَبَكَ حُسْنَهُنْ, that even if you are attracted to them. Now, we pause again and we think, okay, so if this is a cap on how many wives he can have, then if this revelation is at the time of the Battle of the Trench, how could he have married Maymuna and Safiya later on? Because the number of wives was capped. So if we say no, well, no, this then means that this revelation was after the Battle of the Trench. And at a minimum, it would be after the Battle of Khaybar. So then why was that revelation added to Surah Al-Ahzab? Why was it revealed later and added to Surah Al-Ahzab? This is such a predicament that Muhammad Asad concludes that some of this revelation, that in this surah, some of it was revealed as late as the 9th Hijri year, so that you have most of the surah revealed in the 5th year, and some of it revealed nearly towards the end of the life of the Prophet, but then consolidated as part of Surah Al-Ahzab. But if you believe in the unitary thematic message of a surah, that presents a challenge, doesn't it? Methodologically, you'd say, well, but then, so why would a much later revelation that says to the Prophet, okay, no more wives, would be added to Surah Al-Ahzab? Now, I'll tell you something that what adds to this predicament, what adds to this challenge, is that there is a bigger ambiguity that surrounds the wives of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay. So, notice here, first, we get verse 50. يا أيها النبي إنا أحللنا لك أزواجك اللاتي أتيت أجورهن وما ملكت يمينك مما أفاء الله عليك وبنات عمك وبنات عماتك وبنات خالك وبنات خالاتك اللاتي هاجرن معك وامرأة مؤمنة إن وهبت نفسها للنبي إن أراد النبي أن يستنكحها خالصة لك من دون المؤمنين قد علمنا ما فرضنا عليهن في أزواجهن وما ملكت أيمانهن لكي لا يكون عليك حرج وكان الله غفورا رحيما ترجي من تشاء منهن وتؤوي إليك من تشاء ومن ابتغيت ممن عزلت فلا جناح عليك ذلك أدنى أن تقر أعينهن ولا يحزن ويرضين بما آتيتهن كلهن والله يعلم ما في قلوبكم وكان الله عليما حليما. لا يحل لك النساء من بعد ولا أن تبدل بهن من أزواج ولو أعجبك حسنهن إلا ما ملكت يمينك وكان الله على كل شيء رقيبا. So this entire revelation look, so Prophet, we have made lawful to you the wives unto whom you has paid their dowers, so your wives, as well as those whom your right hand has come to possess from among the captives of war, whom God hath bestowed upon thee. And we've made lawful to you the daughters of your paternal uncles and aunts, and the daughters of your maternal uncles and aunts, and who have migrated with you to Yathrib, and any believing woman who offers herself freely to the Prophet, whom the Prophet might be willing to wed. This later being but a privilege for you, and not for other believers, seeing that we have already made known what we have enjoined upon them with regard to their wives and those whom their right hands may possess, and in order that you be not burdened with undue anxiety, for God is indeed most forgiving, a dispenser of grace. Know that mayest put off for a time whichever of them you please, and mayest take unto you whichever you please, and that you seek out any from whom you has kept away for a time, you will incur no sin thereby. This will make it more likely that their eyes are gladdened whenever they see you, and that they do not grieve whenever they are overlooked, and that all of them may find contentment in whatever you has to give them, for God alone knows what is in your heart, and God is indeed all-knowing and forbearing. No other woman shall henceforth be lawful to you, nor art you allowed to supplant any of them by other wives, even though their beauty should please you greatly. None shall be lawful for you beyond those whom you already have come to possess, and God keeps watch over everything. So, first, this revelation that says what is lawful to you are the women that you've married by paying a dower, and a woman that gives herself to the Prophet, wahabat nafsaha. Now, wahabat nafsaha means this is the woman that goes to the Prophet and says, marry me because I give myself to you. And in this situation, you marry this woman without a dower. It's a normal marriage, but it's a dowerless marriage. But dowerless marriages are banned for anyone but the Prophet. So the Prophet can marry a woman for a dower, can marry a woman who gives herself to the Prophet through the hibah process without a dower, but this is not allowed for any other person other than the Prophet. But then it comes and says, you may marry from your paternal uncle's side, you may marry from your maternal uncle's side, as long as they migrated with you. So, from this, we understand that if you are limited to marrying women from Banu Hashim, that's the uncle, the maternal uncle side, and you are limited to marrying from Banu Zahra, That's the maternal uncle side, as long as they migrated with you. So if she didn't migrate with you, then you cannot marry her. And in fact, there is a report that the Prophet ﷺ was engaged to be married to a woman when this revelation was received. Who was not a woman who had not migrated with the Prophet, and after this revelation, the marriage didn't go through because of this revelation. So these verses limit who the Prophet can validly marry to Banu Zahra and Banu Hashim, as long as they migrated to the Prophet, and captives of war, right? And then by this and henceforth you're not allowed to add anyone else or to supplant the badal. Let me just explain the supplant part. In pre-Islamic Arabia, it was not unusual for husbands to exchange wives, to say, I give you my wife, you give me your wife, to switch wives. And most commentators say that what the supplanting part refers to is this exchange thing. And in fact, there is a tradition about a man that comes to the Prophet ﷺ, sees Aisha, and he says to the Prophet, I want to exchange my wife for Aisha. My wife is a gorgeous woman. I'll give her to you if you give me Aisha. And the Prophet responds and said, that's prohibited in Islam. That has become prohibited in Islam. Okay. Now, normally what we all learned is that after this revelation, the Prophet became limited to 9 wives. However, there is a report, there are a number of reports that in which Aisha, it reportedly says, and other than Aisha, there was someone else as well. Who was it? Did I write it down? The man who okay. First, the man who wanted to exchange wives with the Prophet, his name was Ayina bin Hisn al-Ghazari. it's the report is actually much longer than that, because the Aisha asked the Prophet, "What did this man want?" And the Prophet basically, says comments about how about the ignorance of the man. Anyway, so but there is reports that go back attributed to Aisha. And also Salama and Ibn Abbas that say that the Prophet was never limited to 9 wives. That while you have someone like Anas says that these verses told the Prophet not to marry anyone beyond the 9 wives, Aisha is specifically asked, was the Prophet limited to 9 wives? And Aisha responds, why would you say that? And Salama has a very similar tradition. And the response is, no, he was not limited to 9 wives. He was limited by the Quranic revelations to women who are from his maternal side to his paternal side, who migrated with him, and to captives of war. So in fact, there was never a limit, according to these traditions, to the number of wives that the Prophet can take. But what is even more important is that there is an enormous amount of disagreement and confusion about who were the wives of the Prophet. There are some that we absolutely know, like Salama, Aisha, Sauda, and so on. And whether the Prophet married anyone as without a dower, in other words, as a hibah, and whether the Prophet had any captives of war that he didn't marry. And let me just give you a taste of this. Okay, I'm just gonna pick someone like a Qurtubi, just for the woman that the Prophet was supposedly engaged to, and then couldn't marry because of this revelation. Her name is Hani. Okay. What I'm looking for is that you find an enormous amount of disagreement as to whether women, whether the Prophet ﷺ married women through this hibah procedure, whether this process of marrying without a dower. And what is even more surprising is that there are some reports that there were women engaged to marry the Prophet who the marriage didn't go through because he died. In other words, that he was engaged to marry further women when he died. Now, there is an aspect to this is that when I looked into this, I found that when the Prophet died, a number of people, for motivations that we probably can understand, claimed that their daughter or their sister or whoever was engaged to marry the Prophet. But this is one aspect. But there are women all through from the time, from the 5th year Hijrah, from the Battle of the Trench, up to the time that the Prophet ﷺ died, that there are contested reports as to whether they in fact were married to the Prophet or not. And some reports about women, can you, Rami, there's the report about the woman, it's known as المرأة التي استعاذت من الرسول. There are even reports that there are women that he married, but the marriage was never consummated. So, while we know there are 9 marriages, you get an anarchy of reports about whether there were further marriages planned, whether there were marriages entered into after this revelation. And in part, we are told, well, you know, it is because the limiting was not to the number 9, but the limiting was to relatives from the maternal side, paternal side, women who actually migrated with the Prophet, so he couldn't marry a Christian or a Jew, for example, other than captives of war. So, yet another ambiguity at the heart of at the heart of Surah Al-Ahzab. Yet another important historical ambiguity. And that is about who the wives were, the number of the wives, and just keep this in mind. Okay.
The woman's name is Ahzab bint Na'man.
And
You want me to pull up the specific?
is it mentioned in Baghawi or Qurtubi?
I didn't look that up. I can look it up.
Is okay, but do you know what year Asma bint Na'man was?
I have to need a few minutes to look it up.
Okay, it's okay. Yeah. I was asking about. I mean, I don't want to get into that tradition because it's not authentic, and I don't want to. But there is a woman called Asma bint Na'man who, after the whole battle of the Trench, quite late in the Medina period, is supposed to have married the Prophet, and then the Prophet, she says something very rude to the Prophet, and then he releases her. Basically, the marriage is never consummated. before I move on, let me see if I can. One other thing that might work, since okay, I I don't know how to do this without it taking. Okay, so here's like in Tafsir al-Qurtubi. Okay, so he mentions marriages in the 6th Hijri year to Rayhana, for instance, Maimuna in the 7th Hijri year, and then these are, and then he talks about the contested marriages. So he says, for instance, that it is reported that Fatima bint al-Dahhak al-Kalabiyya, that he married her in the 8th Hijri year, but that the marriage was not consummated, and that among them is Asma bint Nu'man bin Ajun, known as Jajuniya. And this is the woman who spoke rudely, and that this marriage wasn't consummated. I'm trying to see if it doesn't give a year. Okay. Then there is among them Qutayla bint Qais. Qutayla her brother is an Ash'as ibn Qais. Reportedly, that she came from Yemen, Hadramut in Yemen, and that by the time she reached Medina, her and her brother learned that the Prophet had died, and they both apostated from Islam. Also, Sharik al-Azdiya, who is known as Ghuzayya bint Jabir Hakim, from the tribe of Abu Bakr, who it was not known whether she actually was married to the Prophet. Khawla bint Huzayl ibn Hubayra, not known whether she was married to the Prophet. Shuraf bint Khalifa, that reportedly married but not consummated. Layla bint al-Khataim, that again married but not consummated. Amra bint Muawiyah Kindiya, that she also married but very late, and arrived, by the time she arrived to consummate the marriage, the Prophet had died. Ibn Jandab bin Dumra al-Junda'iyya, that reportedly she married and consummated. Duba'a bint Amir, Safiya bint Bishama bin Nadla, Layla bint al-Khutaim, Khawla bint Hakim bin Umayyah, Jamra bint al-Haris bin Auf al-Mari, Sauda Qurshiyya, this is other than Sauda, his famous wife. خطبها الرسول وكانت مصبية فقالت أخاف أن يضعوا صبيتي عند رأسك فحمدها ودعا لها. Okay. Now, so when you delve into this, you discover, as I said, that once the Prophet ﷺ died, there were many that came and claimed that he was planning to marry this woman and for this woman, and it didn't go through. But other than that, that the whole issue of, other than the famous wives, wives like Aisha, like Sauda, like Habiba, that the whole issue of the wives of the Prophet ﷺ is surprisingly historically contestable. The amount of historical ambiguities surrounding the historical facts related to his wives are so numerous, and that later Muslims, especially Muslims in the modern age, reacting to criticisms by Orientalists, made an effort to say, well, no, it was capped at 9, and we know it was 9, and there was nothing but 9, and all of that. Now, historical ambiguity is not something that Allah is not aware of. If there's historical ambiguity, Allah knows that there is this historical ambiguity. And when I read the Quran and I know that there is a historical ambiguity that is not resolvable, then I ask myself, what is the message of the Quran in light of this historical ambiguity? So we know that this part of the revelation, it might be that the part that we know for sure is that after the Battle of the Trench, the wives of the Prophet, whoever were his wives at the time, whatever their number, started pressuring him for material things. And that the Quran, Allah came and clearly said, you have a choice. A choice of principle and commitment. Either you choose life with this man based on the principle, or without any hard feelings, he'll let you go. And in fact, the text of the Quran, any fair reading would say there's no retaliation. So I know that I'm taxing your patience, but keep in mind this further historical ambiguity. Beyond saying that, then it will come and say to the Prophet ﷺ, okay, you are limited as to who you can marry. Either you're limited to your current wives, or you're limited to wives who are either people who are related to you, maternal side or paternal side, who migrated with you, or you're limited to captives of war. Whether that's 9 or less than 9 or more than 9, that's the part that's ambiguous. Now, let's go back and pick up the order because we went out of order. So I'm going to come back to this. Okay. So, first Allah explains to the wives of the Prophet that their reward, in the same way that their reward is unlike the reward of other women, their punishment is unlike. So if they stay married to the Prophet and they commit a fahisha, a major sin, their punishment will be far more severe than the normal punishment of other human beings. So there is this added accountability from their status as the mothers of the believers and from remaining married to the Prophet ﷺ. If they don't want this added accountability, then they shouldn't remain married to the Prophet. Okay, so this takes us to 32. يا نساء النبي لستن كأحد من النساء إن اتقيتن فلا تخضعن بالقول فيطمع الذي في قلبه مرض وقلن قولا معروفا. So then Allah makes the point very explicit. Wives of the Prophet, you are not like other women. You have a very special status. So, لا تخضعن بالقول. So, when you speak, make sure that, now the expression here is amazing. لا تخضعن بالقول. Make sure that, let's see how Muhammad Azhar translates it. Okay, so this is 32. He translates as, hence be not over soft in your speech, lest any whose desire is diseased. تخضعن بالقول is not just softness. It's not that. It's don't when you speak to someone, setting aside formality and professionalism, when you speak professionally and formally, there is no khudu' bil qawl. So when I'm speaking in a professional tone, in a formal tone, that's never a khudu' bil qawl. If I am being informal with you, either could be flirtatious, could be cute, could be comical, like I'm not flirting, but I'm just being funny. In a tone other than being professional or formal, especially if that tone communicates that I am of a status lower than you. That's al-khudwa bil-qawl. So the demand here is like speak. So when you say, if you want to be God-fearing, لا تخضعن بالقول means that speak in a manner consistent with your status. You are not the equal to any of these men. You are their mothers. You are superior. So when you speak, speak accordingly. You are not there to joke with them. You are not there to be cutesy with them. You are not there to be their buddies. You're there to play the role of the moral guides to this ummah. But then, look, something that everyone just completely overlooks. وَقُلْنَا قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا. Literally, وَقُلْنَا قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا is like say, and when you speak, speak decently and rationally, reasonably. Notice here that in order for that command to have any meaning whatsoever, it needs a rational reader. If you have a reader that doesn't want to use their brain, they're going to read this and say, but God didn't give me guidance. What does that mean? What does a qawl ma'roof mean? Okay, so it's like saying be modest. What does that mean? I need details. This is very critical to the message, as we'll see, of Surah Al Ahzab. Allah's guidance here requires people who actually use their rational faculties and engage the text as reasonable interpreters of the text, not as robots. Okay. Then right after that, وقرن في بيوتكن ولا تبرجن تبرج الجاهلية الأولى وأقمنا الصلاة وآتينا الزكاة وأطعنا الله ورسوله إنما يريد الله ليذهب عنكم الرجس أهل البيت ويطهركم تطهيرا واذكرن ما يتلى في بيوتكن من آيات الله والحكمة إن الله كان لطيفا خبيرا. So right after that, Allah speaking to them says, first, remain in your homes in dignity. وَقَرْنَ فِي بِيُوتِكُنْ. It doesn't mean you are imprisoned in your homes. It means that the place for your dignity, your status, is your home. But وَلَا تَبَرَّجْنَ تَبَرُّجِ الْجَاهِلِيَّةِ الْأُولَى. So avoid the tabarruj, which we've encountered before. The tabarruj of jahiliyyah, and the commentators on the Quran have long discussions about what al-jahiliyyah al-ula means. What is the first jahiliyyah? And some of them even say, oh, it is the jahiliyyah during the time of Ibrahim, it is jahiliyyah the time of Musa, it is jahiliyyah. We don't need to get into that. What the focal point, though, is when they discuss what is the tabarruj that is intended here, and what is the jahiliyyah that is intended here. And we know that in from various reports that in the Jahili period, it was not uncommon for women to wear clothes that is not sewn on the sides, and to walk, clothes that is open on the sides, or to wear clothes that is so light that it is quite revealing. Or the description of a tabarruj is التكسر والتغنج في or التبختر, that to walk in ways that brings a considerable amount of attention, or either walk or to be in ways or to come out in public in ways that brings a considerable amount of attention to the self. Some of the reports tells us something about the tabarruj al-jahiliyyah that make it sound like, as corrupt as our modern age. So some of these reports, for instance, say that it was not uncommon for a woman in the Jahili period to sit with her husband and her boyfriend, and then to start having sex with both men, with one man focusing on her upper side and another focusing on her lower side, and then for these men to switch. That's an actual paraphrasing of a report, of a number of reports. So there is a broad range in the practices of Jahiliyyah that have to do with very risque behavior, with sexual promiscuity, and with tabarruj, from various levels of calling attention to the self, that again requires that reasonable interpreter that says the point is Allah is saying you have a special status, and your status, you are not to be seen, especially you, in your status, as sexual symbols, or objects of desire, or objects of entertainment. You are to play the role of the mothers of the believers and examples, idols, moral idols for society. Some of the wives of the Prophet, there are some, like Aisha, who obviously her understanding of these ayat didn't prevent her from playing a very active political role. And indeed, the critics of Aisha, shows you how issues of gender mix with issues of interpretation. So the critics of Aisha, among the things that they criticize Aisha for is, you violated the hijab. Sunni interpreters go to great lengths to apologize for Aisha by saying things like, no, she was politically active, but she was always behind a curtain on her camel in a howdaj. Or no, she wasn't actually politically active. She actually went out in the battle of the camel to try to make peace between the warring parties, but she didn't mean to play any active role or take any position. She just wanted to go and, mend the fences. the amount of remarkable apologetics by male interpreters to get around the fact that different wives of the Prophet understood this prescription of, if you speak to someone speak to them behind the hijab, understood it differently. It bothered a lot of male interpreters. So on the one hand, you have someone like Aisha. On the other hand, you have someone like Sauda. Sauda would go to prayer. And in a number of in the reports that is transmitted in different versions, Sauda is asked, why is it that you never go to Hajj or Umrah like the other wives of the Prophet? And she said, well, I have already done my Hajj. But beyond the Hajj, beyond the duty of the Hajj, Allah has أمرني الله أن أقر في بيتي. That Allah has told me to stay in your home. And for me, I will never leave my home. In other words, I will not go traveling again until the day I die. So she would go to prayer in the mosque, but she interpreted that as meaning no more Hajj or Umrah for me. I will remain in my home beyond that. I will not travel until I die. But obviously, the tradition at the same time tells you that other wives didn't see any consistency between this Quranic verse and on going to Hajj or Umrah every year. Okay. So, speak seriously, speak formally, and the place of dignity for you is your home, and avoid tabarruj, drawing any type of, you are the mothers of believers, you are not to draw attention to your physical appearance. And of course, وَأَقِمْنَا الصَّلَاةَ, and prayer and zakah and obey God and the Prophet. And then this most remarkable statement, you who are close, the family of the Prophet, Allah wants to purify you. Now, why would Allah wants يذهب عنكم الرجس آل البيت ويطهركم تطهيرا? Allah wants to purify you, especially you, so that you are beyond reproach and beyond suspicion and beyond blame. That can only make sense if they are to be a moral example, a moral idol. Clearly, when you say Ahl al-Bayt, the very language, a priori, it applies to anyone who is part of the household of the Prophet ﷺ, and also a blood relation of the Prophet. And this clearly applies to the grandchildren of the Prophet, Al-Hasan al-Hussein, and to the daughter of the Prophet, who's married to the cousin of the Prophet. There are a lot of ahadith in which the Prophet ﷺ is covers Al-Hasan al-Hussein and he says, "This is my Ahl al-Bayt," and then Salama and sees him, and she wants to jump under the cover as well and says, "Aren't I part of your Ahl al-Bayt?" And according to these traditions, says, "Yes, and you too." But the moral example, although the wives of the Prophet are to be a functional moral example in the life during the life of the community, the Ahl al-Bayt, those who are blood relations and a part of the household of the Prophet. Now, the remarkable thing is that the wives who play a role, strike that. The coherence across Sunni and Shia sources as to the moral example of Fatima and Ali and Hassan al-Hussein in terms of the historical integrity of the sources, the tawatur al-masadir, the level of tawatur in the transmission of the moral example of these individuals cannot be compared with the historical turbulence as to the historical facts surrounding the historical reality around the wives of the Prophet. So this is one thing that you immediately notice, that if you are looking for moral, ethical roles, the precedents that we get from Fatima and Ali and Hassan and Hussein, these examples reach the level of tawatur. Most of the traditions that we have about what this wife did or that wife did are far more historically ambiguous. I'm going to come back to this point, but let's keep going in order. What time is it?
9:42.
Oh, wow. No, let's not keep going. Okay, so we stopped at 35. We're getting heated. We're getting closer to the. But let's stop.
The master of ceremonies isn't here.
Oh. The master of ceremony is not here. That's my wife who's absconded. She has withdrawn from the battle. She has declared the household awra and retreated.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I actually was saving our house from our dog. So our German Shepherd was eating up the house. And I was actually, alhamdulillah, for the live stream, because I was actually listening to the live stream as I was going down, but I was behind. So I actually didn't realize that you had ended. So I was a little bit behind you. But alhamdulillah, that was truly amazing.
People who attend the next halaqah, who haven't attended this halaqah, will be very lost, because this halaqah was communicating a critical bridge of information. But anyway, that's the thing.
I mean, it was really amazing because, like the all of the ambiguity. I mean, this is all stuff that I don't think. I mean, I've never heard anywhere. I don't know if people have heard it, but this is it adds so much richness to our tradition
And we're
our
not
understanding.
there yet about the purpose for this ambiguity. That we're not there yet. There's a reason, but I haven't
SubhanAllah.
gotten to it.
Alhamdulillah. Well, I have historically been a terrible student of history, so this has been an amazing jihad, and but also an incredible, enlightenment, because it's like when you actually care to learn something, it's so much easier and so much more powerful and so much more meaningful for the tradition. So I know you're building up to something really exciting, and I'm just, so see what happens when you don't come for Eid. It's like you miss all the great stuff. Hopefully people will have a chance to catch up before next time. Thank you for being with us, whoever is with us. Elaine, you get special props because you stayed all the way through, and alhamdulillah, thank you for everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Eid, and we'll look forward to seeing you inshallah on Tuesday. Have a wonderful rest of the weekend. Assalamu alaikum.